For years, humanity had fought against the Sivith Empire, an advanced alien species that controlled vast territories across the galaxy. The battle had been fierce, and the Sivith were powerful, with technology far superior to that of Earth. Yet, against all odds, humanity had emerged victorious. The High Council of the Sivith Empire sat in a grand chamber, a place once filled with power and certainty, now clouded with confusion and disbelief. Princess Vylera stood among them, her eyes scanning the room. The counselors were discussing the terms of surrender, but they could not agree on the one thing that mattered most: the identity of the human who had led the final charge. "Who is he?" Vylera asked, her voice calm but carrying a trace of curiosity. She had been briefed on the hero, Commander Elias Voss, but there was more to his story than the simple reports indicated. "He is the one who turned the tide of the war," said one counselor, his tone filled with both fear and respect. "He led the final attack. The humans call him a hero." Vylera crossed her arms, her mind racing. She had heard the name before, but it felt like a distant echo from her childhood. It was a name that stirred memories she could not quite grasp, memories of a time before war, before the endless battles and shifting alliances. The counselors continued to argue, but Vylera's thoughts were elsewhere. As a child, she had met a human boy. His name had been Elias too. They had been friends, playing in the gardens of her family's palace on her home planet. It was a time of peace, long before the war that tore their worlds apart. But those were memories locked away in the past, buried under years of conflict. Commander Elias Voss. Vylera repeated the name to herself, her brow furrowing. There had to be some connection, but how could it be possible? The boy she had known had been lost in the chaos of the war. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise. The doors to the council chamber opened, and the human representative entered. A tall man, draped in a dark military uniform, stepped forward. His presence was commanding, his posture straight and proud. But it was his face that caught Vylera's attention. His features were hidden by a helmet, a sleek piece of armor that covered his entire head. The counselors shifted in their seats, and an uneasy silence filled the room. "Is this him?" Vylera whispered to herself. "Yes, Princess," said another counselor. "This is Commander Elias Voss, the hero of the war." Vylera studied the human carefully. His movements were confident, almost regal in their precision. There was an air about him, a strength that came from experience and leadership. But there was also something familiar in the way he carried himself, something that tugged at her memories. "Why does he wear his helmet?" Vylera asked, her voice sharp. "It is customary," one of the counselors replied, "for a hero to keep his face hidden. It is a symbol of his humility." Vylera was not convinced. She had seen countless alien leaders and warriors in her time, and none of them had ever hidden behind such a mask. She watched as Commander Voss approached the center of the chamber, his presence overwhelming. The air seemed to change around him, charged with the weight of his reputation. He stood silently, his gaze never leaving the counselors, but Vylera noticed something odd. As he turned to face her, his eyes met hers for a brief moment, a fleeting glance, yet in that moment, something stirred inside her. She couldn't explain it. It was as if she had known him for a lifetime, as if their fates were intertwined in some strange way. The counselors began to speak, discussing the terms of surrender, the future of the Sivith Empire, and the terms of the peace treaty. Vylera's mind, however, was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious human warrior before her. "Commander Voss," Vylera finally spoke up, her voice cutting through the noise of the room. "You led the final charge that ended the war. You are the hero of humanity. But tell me, what makes you so special? What is it that you have that allowed you to defeat the mighty Sivith Empire?" There was a pause. The room grew still. Commander Voss did not immediately answer, his eyes narrowing, as if weighing her words carefully. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I didn't defeat your empire, Princess," His voice was deep, steady. I simply showed my people that the impossible was possible. I led them not because I am special, but because I believed in them. Vailira was taken aback. She had expected arrogance, pride, maybe even hatred. But instead, there was a quiet humility in his words. She looked at him again, feeling that same sense of familiarity. And for the first time in a long while, Vailira wondered if there was more to this war, to this peace, than she had ever been taught. The grand hall was filled with tension. The Scifi royal palace, once a place of celebration and unity, now seemed heavy with the weight of defeat. Vailira stood at the edge of the balcony, looking out over the sprawling city below. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the streets. The people of the empire were still adjusting to the fact that the war was over, and that they had lost. Princess Vailira had grown up in a world of power, comfort, and certainty, but now everything had changed. The Scifi were no longer the unstoppable force they once were. They had surrendered, and humanity had emerged victorious. Vailira couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had been trained for years to lead her people, to make decisions for the future of the empire. But this peace, this surrender, felt wrong. There was more to it than just a simple military defeat. It had been days since the war had ended, and the humans were still in control of the situation. Vailira had expected the conquerors to be arrogant and demanding, but instead they had shown an unexpected humility. The humans didn't seem interested in dominating the Scifi. They spoke of peace, of rebuilding, of cooperation, and yet it was hard to trust them. She had been to the human camp to meet with their leaders, but it was Commander Elias Voss who had caught her attention the most. He wasn't just a soldier or a general. He was a hero. His name had become a symbol of human strength, of their ability to overcome the odds. And yet there was something about him that unsettled her. Her mind kept drifting back to their brief meeting. The way he had spoken to her, as if they were more than just enemies on opposite sides of a war. The way his eyes had locked onto hers, as if he knew her, as if he had seen her before. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, and it haunted her. "Princess Vailira," a voice called, interrupting her thoughts. She turned to see one of her advisors standing at the door, looking concerned. "Yes?" Vailira asked, her voice flat. "The human commander has requested a private meeting with you," the advisor said. "He says it's important." Vailira raised an eyebrow. Why would Elias Voss want to meet with her? Was this some sort of trick? A way for him to assert his power over her, to make her feel small and insignificant? She wasn't sure what to make of it, but her curiosity got the better of her. "I'll meet with him," she said, stepping away from the balcony and walking toward the door. The meeting was set in a small, quiet room inside the palace. It was simple, nothing extravagant, but it was private, away from the eyes of the counselors and her advisors. As Vailira entered, she saw Elias Voss standing by the window, looking out over the city. He was no longer wearing his helmet, and his face was visible for the first time since their previous encounter. He turned to face her as she entered, his gaze steady and unwavering. There was no arrogance in his eyes, no sense of superiority. Instead, there was something else, something familiar. "Princess Vailira," Elias said, his voice calm, but with a hint of warmth. "Thank you for meeting with me." Vailira didn't speak right away. She studied him, trying to make sense of the strange feeling in her chest. He was human, an enemy, yet there was something about him that felt right. She had to remind herself that he was the one who had defeated her people, the one who had led humanity to victory. "I don't know why you've requested this meeting," Vailira said, her voice cautious. "We've already agreed to the terms of surrender. What more is there to discuss?" Elias smiled slightly, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was more like the smile of someone who understood something she didn't. "I didn't ask to meet with you because I want to talk about the war," he said. "I wanted to talk about you, and about something I think you've forgotten." Vailira's eyes narrowed. "Forgotten? What are you talking about?" Elias took a step forward, his gaze soft but intense. "I'm not here to lecture you or make demands. I'm here to remind you of something, of who you are, and who I am." Villera felt a chill run down her spine. She knew exactly what he was referring to now. The memories she had pushed away for so long were beginning to resurface. The young boy she had known before the war, the one she had played with in the palace gardens. He had been human, like Elias. "You can't be," she whispered, her voice faltering. "I am," Elias said quietly, nodding. "I'm the boy you knew, the one who disappeared after the war began. I'm the one who survived and became what I am now. Elias Voss." Villera felt her heart race. It was impossible. The boy she had known had been lost in the chaos of war. She had been told he died. How could this man standing before her be the same Elias? "I never wanted any of this," Elias continued, his voice tinged with sadness. "I never wanted to be a hero or a soldier. But sometimes, the world forces us to become things we never expected. And now, here we are." Villera stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. Everything she had known about the war, about the humans, seemed to crumble around her. Elias wasn't the enemy. He never had been. The room was silent for a long time, neither of them speaking. There was so much Villera wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come. She felt as though the world had shifted beneath her feet, and she was left struggling to keep her balance. Finally, Elias broke the silence. "I didn't come here to make things harder for you, Princess. I came because I want to help. I want to show you that there's more to this war than just victory and defeat." Villera nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. The human she had once known was standing before her, but everything had changed. And as much as she wanted to hold on to the past, she knew the future was calling her. And it was a future she had never expected. Villera couldn't shake the shock of Elias' words. The man standing before her wasn't just a hero of the war, a commander with the power to change the course of history. He was someone from her childhood, someone she had thought lost forever. For a long moment, she just stared at him, trying to process what he had said. "But how?" she whispered. "How are you still alive?" Elias' expression softened, and he looked away, as if the question had touched a wound he had kept hidden for many years. "It's a long story," he said quietly. "A story I never wanted to tell, but I think you deserve to know." Villera felt a strange pull to him. Her entire life, she had been told who her enemies were, who to trust, who to fear. And yet this man, this boy from her past, was a human, one of the very people she had spent years fighting against. The very people her empire had crushed in so many battles. Yet here he was, standing in front of her, someone she could almost remember, yet the memories were fading. "What happened to you?" she asked softly, her voice almost breaking. Elias exhaled slowly, as if gathering his thoughts. "When the war began, I was just a child. You were a child too, remember? We played in the gardens, talked about our dreams. Then, one day, the war came. My family was torn apart. I had to survive, to fight for what I believed in. The war changed everything." Villera could hear the pain in his voice, the heaviness of all those lost years. She could see the scars in his eyes, even though they weren't visible on his face. It was the same way she felt, the weight of the past, of the decisions she had made, of the people she had lost. "I thought you died," she whispered. "They told me you were dead." Elias gave a small, bitter laugh. "That's what they wanted you to believe. But I didn't die. I was taken, forced into the human military. I spent years in their camps, fighting battles I didn't even understand. I had no choice, but something inside me always remembered who I was. And when the time came, when I had the power to take charge, I did. I led my people, and eventually, we won. But it wasn't just about victory. It was about survival, about making sure the future didn't repeat the mistakes of the past." Villera's mind raced. The boy she had known had become a man who led the charge in a war that had changed everything. Her empire, her people, had all been swept up in the conflict. But the human soldier standing before her was more than just a soldier. He was a reminder of everything she had lost. She remembered their last meeting, the day he had disappeared. It had been so sudden, so chaotic. Her father, the king, had ordered the evacuation of the royal family as war approached. She had been sent away, hidden from the dangers that were to come. But Elias, he had stayed behind, refusing to leave his family. "I never thought I would see you again," Vailera said, her voice trembling. "When I was told you had died, I couldn't believe it. I always thought that somehow you would come back." Elias nodded. "I didn't have a choice. But I never forgot you, Vailera. You were always in my thoughts, even in the darkest times. When I led the charge to end the war, it was more than just strategy. I did it for you, for all the people who had lost so much." Vailera didn't know what to say. Everything she had known about the war, about humans, about herself, was changing. It was hard to reconcile the boy she had once known with the man standing before her now. Elias stepped closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Vailera, there's so much more you need to know. The war, the destruction, it was just one side of the story. The truth is, both of our peoples have suffered, and now it's time for us to rebuild. But rebuilding means facing the past. It means facing the choices we made and how we move forward from here." Vailera took a deep breath, trying to process all of this. Her mind was spinning, but Elias' words made sense. The war was over, and the terms of surrender had already been decided. But it wasn't just about peace anymore. It was about understanding, about finding a way to heal the wounds that ran deep between their peoples. "I've seen what your people have done to mine," Vailera said softly, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. "I've seen the devastation, the pain, and I felt it too. I'd lost so much. My family, my home, my people. It's hard to imagine that we can ever truly move on from this." Elias' eyes softened with understanding. "I know, Vailera. I know how hard it is. But peace starts with understanding. It starts with people like us, who've seen both sides of the war. We have a chance to build something new, something better." Vailera looked into his eyes, and for the first time since the war began, she saw hope. Hope not just for the future of her empire, but for herself. She had been so focused on survival, on the need to protect her people, that she had forgotten what it meant to trust, to believe in the possibility of something better. "I don't know what the future holds," she said quietly. "But I know this. I can't move forward without knowing the truth. And now, I think I'd finally understand." Elias smiled softly, his face full of both sadness and relief. "That's all any of us can do, Vailera. Understand the past and use that knowledge to shape the future." As they stood there, the silence between them felt different. It was no longer a barrier, but a bridge, connecting two people from opposite sides of a war, two people who had shared a past they were now ready to face together. The days that followed were filled with difficult conversations, tough decisions, and moments that would shape the future of both the human and alien worlds. Vailera spent more time with Elias, learning about his life after their separation. As painful as it was, each conversation revealed pieces of the puzzle that had kept them apart for so long. It became clear to her that Elias had been fighting for more than just survival. He had been fighting to end a war that had torn both their worlds apart. Still, Vailera struggled. The scars of war ran deep, and the weight of her responsibilities as the princess of her people pressed heavily on her shoulders. Her father's kingdom was in ruins, and many of her people blamed the humans for their suffering. How could she convince them to move forward, to rebuild, when so much had been lost? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Vailera and Elias sat together in the royal gardens. The palace was quiet, but the air between them buzzed with tension, the kind that only comes when two people are on the verge of understanding something far greater than themselves. "How do we fix this?" Vailera asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes gazed out at the garden, But she wasn't really looking at the flowers or the trees. She was searching for answers in the shadows. Elias, sitting beside her, took a deep breath. We start by acknowledging the pain. All of it. The destruction, the loss, the anger. We can't just ignore it and hope everything will be fine. But we also can't keep fighting. The only way to move forward is by working together. Villera nodded, but doubt still lingered in her mind. But how do I ask my people to trust the very humans who destroyed so much? They won't forgive us. They think we're weak. They're scared, Elias said, his voice steady. Just like your people, just like mine. Fear makes us do things we wouldn't normally do. But fear is a choice. And so is trust. Villera felt a surge of frustration. Trust. How could anyone expect her to trust anyone after everything that had happened? But when she looked at Elias, something shifted inside her. The connection they had once shared as children was still there, hidden beneath the layers of time and war. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something new. She exhaled slowly. I don't know if my people will ever trust the humans. But I want to try. I have to try. Elias placed a hand gently on hers, a gesture that felt surprisingly comforting. You don't have to do it alone. I'll help you. Together, we can show them that peace is possible. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Villera felt a small spark of hope, a hope that had long been buried under the weight of war and duty. Maybe there was a way to rebuild everything they had lost. Maybe there was a way for humans and aliens to coexist, to heal together. The next few days were a blur of meetings and planning. Villera worked with her advisors, while Elias met with the human generals, strategizing a way to bring both sides to the table. The war may have been officially over, but the real challenge was just beginning. They needed to rebuild, to restore what had been destroyed, not just the cities and the lands, but the trust between their peoples. One evening, after a long day of discussions, Villera and Elias stood together on the balcony of the palace, overlooking the ruins of the once great city. The sky was clear, the stars twinkling brightly above them. For a moment, they simply stood in silence, taking in the weight of everything that had happened. I never imagined I would be here, Villera said softly, breaking the silence. I thought I would die in battle, or that I would never see you again. But here we are, trying to rebuild what's left of everything. Elias nodded. We're survivors, Villera. We've made it through the worst. Now it's up to us to make sure that our people don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Villera looked at him, her heart heavy with the responsibility she carried. Do you think it's possible? Can we really rebuild what's been broken? Elias turned to face her fully. I think we can, but it's going to take time. It's going to take patience, understanding, and a willingness to face the hard truths. But if anyone can do it, it's us. We've seen both sides. We understand the pain. We know the cost of war. And now we can show our people the value of peace. Villera's heart swelled with a mixture of fear and hope. The path ahead would not be easy, but she couldn't turn away from it. Not when she had a chance to change everything. I'm scared, she admitted, but I'm not afraid to try. Elias smiled, his eyes full of determination. We'll do this together, Villera. You're not alone. The words hung in the air between them, a promise that both of them would keep, no matter what came next. In the days that followed, the first steps toward peace were taken. It wasn't easy. There were protests, arguments, and deep distrust. But slowly, the seeds of a new beginning were planted. The leaders of both sides began to meet, to listen to each other. There were still many battles to fight, but these were not battles of war. These were battles of the heart, of understanding, of healing. Villera and Elias continued to work side by side, each day strengthening their bond. The people watched, unsure at first, but gradually they began to see the change. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't fast, but it was progress. And for the first time in a long time, hope began to blossom in the hearts of both humans and aliens alike. As the weeks passed, Villera and Elias found themselves at the forefront of the most difficult challenge they had ever faced, bringing two worlds back together. The task was daunting, and the pressure was immense. Yet each day, they grew stronger as a team, each relying on the other for strength, support, and guidance. Villera's heart was torn in two directions. She knew that the survival of her people depended on the success of this peace effort, but the memories of war were still fresh in her mind. The anger, the grief, the loss. How could she ask her people to forgive the humans? How could she ask them to trust again? Elias, on the other hand, understood her fears all too well. As a human, he had seen firsthand the devastating consequences of the war, but he also believed in the strength of both their people. He knew that, in order to move forward, they needed to face the painful truths of the past and acknowledge the hurt that had been caused. Their meetings with both human and alien leaders were tense. The room would fill with silence as each side made their points, the distrust and bitterness thick in the air. But through it all, Villera and Elias remained steadfast. They would not let their people fall back into the darkness of war. They had made a promise to each other and to their people, and they would see it through, no matter the cost. One evening, as they walked through the palace gardens after another long day of negotiations, Villera stopped and turned to Elias. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of frustration and determination. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Elias. The weight of everything is too much. My people won't listen. They don't trust me." Elias looked at her, his expression soft but resolute. "I know it's hard, but we can't give up now. We've already come so far, and if we stop now, all the sacrifices will have been for nothing. We have to keep pushing forward, no matter how difficult it gets." Villera sighed, looking up at the stars above. The sky was clear, the same sky that had watched over them as children. It felt like a lifetime ago, when they had last been together in this garden, carefree and innocent, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. "I never thought it would come to this," she said quietly. "I thought I could fix everything on my own, that I could protect my people. But now, I don't know where to begin." Elias placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice filled with compassion. "You're not alone in this, Villera. You don't have to fix everything by yourself. We'll fix it together. We'll help each other. And eventually, your people will see that. They'll see the strength in you, in us." Villera looked at him, her eyes softening. She had always admired Elias's unwavering belief in the possibility of peace. Even when everything seemed hopeless, he remained steadfast in his conviction that the future could be better. And for the first time, Villera began to believe it too. The next day, they held another crucial meeting, this time with the heads of both the human and alien councils. It was a tense affair, with old wounds being reopened and painful truths laid bare. There were many who still clung to their hatred, who believed that the other side was to blame for the war, for the destruction of their families, their homes. But Villera and Elias refused to let the hatred dominate the conversation. They stood together, side by side, and shared their story. They spoke of their childhood, of their shared memories, of the bond they had once had. They reminded the leaders that they were not enemies. They were survivors, and they had a responsibility to build a future for the generations that would follow. The room fell silent as the weight of their words settled over the assembly. For the first time in years, there was no shouting, no accusations, only silence. And then, one by one, the leaders began to speak. Slowly, the walls began to come down. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As the meeting came to a close, Villera and Elias stepped outside into the cool evening air. Villera let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I think we made a difference today," she said softly, her voice filled with hope. Elias nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's just the beginning, but it's a good start." They stood there for a moment, taking in the quiet of the night. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if offering their approval. For the first time, Villera felt a sense of peace, a small but undeniable flicker of hope for the future. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but with Elias by her side, Valeria knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. They were no longer just two people from different worlds. They were allies, united by their shared goal of peace. And that unity, that bond, would carry them through the darkest days. As they walked back toward the palace, Valeria couldn't help but think about the future. There would still be obstacles to overcome, old scars to heal, and enemies to silence. But together, they would rebuild what had been broken, one step at a time. And slowly but surely, the war would fade into the past, a memory of the darkness they had left behind. The days following the pivotal meeting were filled with uncertainty, yet the air was thick with a strange kind of hope. Valeria and Elias had sparked a conversation that hadn't been possible for years, but it was only the beginning. Now, the true work began, the work of healing old wounds and creating trust where there had been none. Valeria walked through the palace halls, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She was lost in thought, reflecting on how far they had come since the first days of the war. The pain was still fresh in her heart, but it was different now. Now there was a way forward. The pain no longer felt like the end of everything. It was the beginning of something new. As she turned a corner, she came face to face with Elias. He was waiting for her, as if he knew she'd be there. He offered her a warm smile, and for a moment, the weight of their responsibilities lifted. "Ready for today?" Elias asked, his voice calm and steady. Valeria nodded, though doubt still lingered in her mind. "I don't know if I am," she admitted. "Every time I think we've made progress, there's something new. Another obstacle, another challenge. It's hard to see how we'll ever get past it." Elias stepped closer, his expression softening with understanding. "We take it one step at a time. We don't have to solve everything today. As long as we keep pushing forward, we'll get there." Valeria met his gaze, her heart heavy with both fear and determination. "I hope you're right." The room they entered was filled with leaders, both human and alien, seated at a long table. The atmosphere was tense, but this time there was something different in the air, an undercurrent of possibility. The past few meetings had been filled with arguments, accusations, and stubborn pride. But today, there was a quiet sense of change. Valeria took her seat at the head of the table, with Elias by her side. The alien leaders watched her with cautious eyes, waiting to see if she had the strength to carry them through the final stages of peace. The human leaders, on the other hand, seemed eager to finally close the chapter on the war. "We're here today," Valeria began, her voice strong but filled with the weight of the situation, "because we have all seen the cost of this conflict. It has taken from all of us, and now it's time to take the first step toward rebuilding. To move forward, we must trust each other." There was a long silence as the leaders exchanged glances. Some faces were filled with skepticism, while others looked hopeful, unsure of what to believe. "We can't change the past," Elias added, his voice steady and confident. "But we can shape the future. Our people, both human and alien, are ready to rebuild. Together." At first, the response was slow, hesitant. One of the alien leaders spoke up, his voice deep with doubt. "Trust is a fragile thing. How do we rebuild that trust after so much destruction?" Valeria didn't hesitate. "We begin by being honest. We acknowledge the wrongs that have been done, not to dwell in the past, but to ensure it never happens again. We must be open with each other and not let fear control us." Elias nodded. "It's not going to be easy. There will be setbacks. But we can do this. Together." A murmur of agreement passed through the room, though there were still many who held reservations. Valeria could see that the road ahead would not be without difficulty. But she had come to realize that change didn't happen overnight. It was a process, slow, sometimes painful, but necessary. The meeting continued with debates and discussions, but the tone had shifted. There was less shouting and more listening. Old enemies began to speak of compromise, of understanding. Small steps were being made toward the common goal of peace. As the meeting drew to a close, Villera and Elias left the room together, both exhausted but feeling a small flicker of accomplishment. "We did it," Villera said quietly, her voice filled with both surprise and gratitude. "They're listening." Elias smiled, his eyes reflecting the same hope that had begun to grow in her heart. "It's just the beginning. But it's a start." That evening, they walked through the gardens once again. The night was calm, and the air was cool, a welcome contrast to the heat of the day's discussions. The stars above twinkled brightly, as if offering a silent blessing on the work they were doing. "I never thought it would come to this," Villera said, her voice low. "I never thought I would see a day when my people would be willing to trust the humans. After everything." Elias gently placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice filled with warmth. "You were always the bridge between the two sides, Villera. You've always had the strength to lead them, even when you didn't believe it yourself. Don't forget that." Villera stopped walking, looking up at the stars. "I feel like we're on the edge of something, like the world is about to change." Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It already is, and we're part of that change, together." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the stars above. The journey ahead was uncertain, and there would still be many challenges to face. But for the first time in a long while, Villera felt a sense of peace, a sense that the future wasn't as bleak as it once seemed. The war had been a dark chapter in their history, but it didn't have to define them forever. With each step, they were rewriting the story, and no matter how hard the journey was, they would continue to walk it together. The sun rose over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the palace. It was a new day, and with it came a new beginning. Villera stood at the balcony, looking out over the sprawling city below. She could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, but for the first time in a long while, it wasn't an impossible burden. There was hope in the air, a hope that had been absent for too long. Elias joined her, standing quietly beside her. His presence brought a sense of calm that Villera had come to rely on. He didn't need to say anything. They both knew the importance of this moment. "Today is the day," Villera said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We've reached the final step. The treaty is ready." Elias nodded. "It's hard to believe, isn't it? After everything we've been through, it's finally here. A chance for peace." Villera glanced at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you. You've been my strength." Elias smiled, his eyes warm with affection. "We've always been stronger together. This isn't just your victory, Villera. It's ours." Together, they walked to the grand hall, where the leaders from both sides had gathered. The alien and human representatives were seated, their faces a mixture of anticipation and doubt. But this time, there was no hostility in the room. No more angry words or accusations. There was only the promise of a better future. Villera and Elias took their seats at the front of the room. She felt a sense of power, but it wasn't the power that came from control. It was the power of unity, of the shared hope that filled the space, the power of what they had accomplished together. The alien council leader, an older being with deep blue skin and silver eyes, stood up to speak. "Today marks a turning point in our history. We are no longer enemies, but allies. We have witnessed the courage and strength of the humans, and we stand here today because of the leadership of Princess Villera. She has shown us that trust and cooperation can overcome even the greatest of conflicts." Villera stood, her heart swelling with pride but also humility. She knew that this moment was not hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had fought for peace, to those who had believed that a better world was possible. "Thank you," she began, her voice calm but firm. "This is a victory for all of us, humans and aliens alike. We've learned that we are not so different after all. Our desires for peace, for safety, for love and understanding are the same." The room was silent, each person processing her words. It was a quiet moment, but in it, Valeria could feel the weight of history shifting. They were creating something new, something that would be remembered for generations to come. Elias stood beside her, his presence a constant reminder of the bond they had forged through their trials. "This treaty is just the beginning," he said. "The road ahead will not be easy, but as long as we stay united, there is no challenge we cannot overcome." With those words, the treaty was signed. Valeria felt a deep sense of relief wash over her as the final strokes were made on the document. The war was truly over. The past, with all its pain and suffering, was now behind them. In its place stood the promise of a future where both humans and aliens could live in peace. As the leaders began to congratulate each other, Valeria looked out at the crowd. She saw the faces of those who had fought, those who had suffered, and those who had believed. They were all here today, united in this moment of triumph. The celebrations lasted long into the night. Music filled the air, and laughter echoed through the halls. For the first time, Valeria felt the joy of knowing that the long road to peace had finally reached its destination. Later, as the last of the guests departed, Valeria and Elias stood together once more, watching the stars from the palace gardens. It was a quiet night, peaceful and still, the kind of night that felt like the world was holding its breath. "I can't believe it's over," Valeria said softly. "After everything we've been through, I never thought I'd see this day." Elias smiled, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "It's not just over, Valeria. It's the beginning of something new. A new era, one where we can all live in harmony." Valeria looked up at the stars, feeling the sense of peace she hadn't known before. The future was no longer a distant dream. It was real, and it was theirs to shape. "I'm ready for that future," she said, her voice full of determination. Elias nodded. "So am I." The two stood in silence for a moment, side by side, as the stars above seemed to shine just a little brighter. They had fought for this moment, and they had earned it, but the real work was just beginning. Together, they would build a new world, one where trust, unity, and hope would always triumph. And as they watched the first light of dawn break over the horizon, Valeria and Elias knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The war was over. The peace had begun, and the future was theirs.